Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. The city in your latest novel is referred to as exactly that. It's always the city, never a named city, whether real or imagined. But I started reading the book and I saw a street intersection that could have been downtown Los Angeles, but then I noticed there's a big construction project in the book that could be in Washington, D.C. And then I noticed a Detroitian sense of abandonment to it. How many cities informed this city that is the city in the new book?
Well, I think in some ways the reader brings their own experience of cities to the book. I have my certain set of cities that I know reasonably well. London, probably the one I know best still, despite having been here in LA for 10 years. I guess I didn't want to make it too specifically LA, because it seems to me that LA, although it has many of the features of every city, there's so much about it that's so odd, that's so singular, that LA can't really stand in for any other city.
Not that it stops the Hollywood from trying to do that, 100 times a year.
Well, I mean, they do it the other way, don't they? That they'll film in Toronto, and that will be New York, or they'll film in Vancouver, and that will be LA. And then, of course, there's all this stealth filmmaking that's going on around LA. People, just setting up their cameras in the corner of the Ralph's parking lot. It was a book that seemed to drive editors mad, at least in its first incarnation, because some people looked at it and wanted me to make it far more specific. These were, I think, without exception, American editors who read it and said, well, it's clearly a European city.
That hadn't occurred to me.
It hadn't really occurred to me either. And they were saying, but you should make it London, make it a kind of a treasure chase, a treasure hunt in London. And I kind of felt I'd rather done my London book. Not that you can't do any number of London books, but my previous book, Bleeding London, that seemed to, which I think in some ways is a bit of a companion piece to The City Under the Skin. That sort of, it hadn't exhausted everything I had to say, but I felt I'd sort of done that slightly, sort of chasing down the city, hunting through the city. And I didn't want to make it a kind of nebulous, any kind of city. I wanted there to be specifics. I wanted there to, it has a subway system of a rather specific sort, which I felt is quite LA-ish. That idea of it's the subway system that is kind of not really wanted, and people have ambivalent feelings about it, and it's not used terribly well. Whereas in London, Paris, San Francisco, people love the subway system and use it in a real day-to-day way. So I was very keen that it wasn't just a catch-all fantasy, that it was a somewhere, that it wasn't a nowhere. And the people who've read it, I guess they've put it between the coasts, and have said that it resembles places that, by and large, I've never been, like Baltimore, where I've certainly never been, and I haven't been to Detroit, which you mentioned, although I think we all kind of feel we know Detroit from its good and bad press. So I was delighted. I finally found the editor there at FSG who did get it, who said it was clearly an American city, and that it was a real place, not a non-place, and that, she told me, and I don't think it was simply flattering. I thought that this was quite an unusual thing for people to do. But in fact, she says, dozens of books come in over the transom which are set in a kind of mythical or fantasy city. And And she said, most of them don't work. And, whether I got it to work or not, at least my editor thought I got it to work. And I didn't want it to be an invisible city. I didn't want it to be quite a Calvino. There were times when I thought there was a little bit of Alan Moore and his cities are always real. You see, often it's London, but it certainly isn't always London. And I guess Sin City. I mean, there's no shortage of mythical cities, and many of them do seem to be in kind of fantasies or comic books. I mean, Gotham City and Metropolis, which I think are probably both stand-ins for New York, in fact, are they not? So I wanted it to, without sort of laboring it too much, I wanted it to be real, but I didn't want it to be too specific.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from the very real city of Los Angeles, California, up in the Hollywood Hills, sitting down with Geoff Nicholson, author of books both fictional and non-fictional. The non-fictional books include, very recently, it's not available in the U.S., but it is available in the U.K., but I think you can get it, Walking in Ruins, and its predecessor, which is available, The Lost Art of Walking. The fiction books include the aforementioned Bleeding London, not London Bleeding, right? Bleeding London, yes. Bleeding London, Gravity's Volkswagen, The Hollywood Dodo, and most recently this novel we've been discussing, The City Under the Skin. At the center of The City Under the Skin, we have this hotel, the Telstar Hotel, which is, it's the type of building we'll know from various cities, especially American cities. This 60s space-age building that's essentially abandoned, in the case of the novel, literally abandoned, now a squat, but never really found a good use. I'm reminded of a bit of the theme building at LAX, right?
Yeah, the important thing to remember is that there is a revolving restaurant in the
yes, that one actually revolves. So I guess this could be the Bonaventure if it was abandoned one day.
That's right. I think we're all fascinated by, as it were, the future of the past, or the past of the future. That nothing seems so square as old-fashioned visions of the future. I'm certainly old enough to remember in London there used to be what was at the time the Post Office Tower. And it had a revolving restaurant. And this was regarded as the very fanciest thing.
Was that a new technology at the time? Why did we love those so much in that era that we built so many in the 60s and 70s?
I can't give you a chapter. I can't give you a chapter and verse on when. But they're certainly, in my mind, and I suspect everyone else's, they are associated with the 60s, aren't they? With a kind of optimism. And of course, they're always up in the sky. Yes. And that seems to somehow tie in with leaving the Earth and looking towards space. And a lot of them are actually very similar. The technology, it's a revolving disc with a very, very low-powered engine, so that it's quite easy to get them to revolve. But it is one of those sort of, not an obsession, but one of those small interests of mine, which I've never completely pursued. And every now and again I think, there must be a book in the history of the revolving restaurant. But it's also a kind of an optimism, right? That we can do anything. We can take very sophisticated technology, but use it in a rather frivolous end. Right. And that seems to be all part of the 60s anyway. The one I'm thinking of in London is, it was the Post Office Tower. It's now British Telecom. And it was a site of a terrorist bomb was planted there in the 80s by the IRA. And it's never revolved since. And I think it still exists. And I think that the staff from British Telecom go in there and use it as a canteen. But it doesn't revolve. And I guess that's sort of a touchstone of, it's not when the 60s ended, but that kind of optimism of availability, and we will all share in the technology. It ended when you could plant a terrorist bomb there. And I guess, within the book, it is that sort of failure of optimism that we thought technology would solve everything, that we could build our way out of any problem. And I guess we also thought I mean, either we thought that things would last, or maybe it didn't matter whether things would last. that you could, you could make a silly building with a revolving tower, and it would work or it wouldn't. But the Telstar Hotel that's there in the novel has this kind of slow fading away, and it's this focus for various plans of restoration and revitalizing the city, which I think we're all fairly common with, and sort of a notion of heritage, and that we want to hold on to the past and reclaim the past and make it new, and at the same time, there are always interests within a city that just want to raise it and start again from scratch, and that these competing forces of the city being built and rebuilt and being destroyed are kind of constantly happening. And I guess they tend to happen most when there's a certain kind of, prosperity, for want of a better word. I mean, that when I first came to Hollywood in the late 70s, it was failing, and it was failing rapidly. And the idea that anyone would open a restaurant or build an apartment block there was literally inconceivable. And so nobody conceived of it. And now, of course, the trendiest bars would be found there on what were formerly the grimmest bits of Hollywood Boulevard. And, people want to live in fancy apartment blocks on the corner of Hollywood and Vine. And I guess we feel this is a good thing. At the same time, I do have a certain affection for a certain amount of grime and patina and indeed ruin. But you don't want the whole city to fall into ruin completely.
Right. That whole most ruined age of Hollywood in the 70s, it's funny because I think, that was going on in Hollywood. It was falling to pieces, hookers everywhere, nothing really working as it should. But then a few miles over, downtown, that's the moment when the Bonaventure and its revolving restaurant was opening. What was going on there?
I don't know.
Is there just a huge disconnect between different parts of Los Angeles? That seems like it's a characteristic of the city you can never ignore.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, that there is this disconnect because, where we are now, this is always, we're 2 miles at most from Hollywood Boulevard. And the Hollywood Hills are only 2 miles from Hollywood Boulevard. And however grim things were getting down there, there were people who were still sitting by their swimming pools in the Hollywood Hills. Right.
Only 2 miles is another characteristic Los Angeles expression, I think. That's not a short distance.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that people talk about with London is that it's a series of villages. Mm-hmm. And I know that people talk about LA as being a decentered kind of town, but it always seems to me that, in London, New York, are very decentered places. People who go to Brick Lane don't go to Notting Hill. People who go to Highgate don't go to South London. And, nobody but tourists goes to Trafalgar Square.
Yes. I didn't even make it over there when I was in London recently.
No, I mean, who does? Nobody does. People, I do see these, I've talked about this quite a lot, but I see these poor tourists wandering along Hollywood Boulevard, which now is, a pleasant enough place to walk. And they've come, and they're not quite sure why. And they're looking down at the sidewalk and seeing the Walk of Fame. And they're kind of gazing around saying, this is the attraction, this is the tourist attraction. And, I don't know whether they end up in Ripley's Believe It or Not or the Guinness Book of Records.
Someone's going in those places.
Well, quite. Yes. I think they find themselves there and say, well, I'm here, I have to do something. But I did see some list of the most disappointing tourist sites in the world. And certainly the Hollywood Walk of Fame is up there, which I understand. But also, Stonehenge is on that list, and I don't think that's fair.
It factors into your book, Walking in Ruins, though, because of course, what could be more logical a ruin to walk in than Stonehenge? What's a more walked-in ruin than Stonehenge, if you think about it?
Well, so at this point in history, it's a walk around.
Yes, walk around ruin.
Yeah, I just think there is something about Stonehenge that really does do the business of looking ancient and spiritual, for want of a better word.
I didn't realize there was an underground train that goes up to it. Was that how it happens in Stonehenge? I think I learned this from your book. Do you have to take some sort of train to it, or
No, not a train. I think that may be that's probably an Anglo-American problem. It's a subway, but it's a walking subway.
Oh, I see. It did seem really incongruous to me when I think they built a train up to Stonehenge.
Oh, God, yes, no, they divided by a common language. No,
this is why Walking in Ruins isn't going to make it in the U.S. with these problems.
Well, what's the English? What's the American
Tunnel.
English? It's a tunnel. It's just a tunnel.
Yeah.
But yes, you're across the street, across the road.
I pictured some tram.
Oh, well, that's very nice.
They should build that.
Should be a monorail, shouldn't it? Well, that's another thing. That's another version of the future that we've lost, isn't it? The monorail and the revolving restaurant. That was all. That was all terribly exciting. And of course, Seattle still has its monorail, does it not?
It goes that mile, and it does it well.
Yes.
It's something that Ray Bradbury always agitated for. Of course, he was a famous non-driving Angelino, in addition to being a famous sci-fi visionary. And he would do many a speech around Los Angeles, arguing for the monorail as the future. And it seems, I don't know why we consider monorails the stuff of science fiction, as in the same way we class them with revolving restaurants, but we just kind of do, don't we?
We do, and they tend to be in rather playful places. They tend to be in Disneyland. They seem to be recreational. And I agree with you. I don't know why.
It just happens. They tend to be in close proximity to revolving restaurants, of course, in Seattle, the Space Needle and thereabouts. But I'm sure Disneyland has something revolving. The monorail's near. But I wonder, this sense of ruin, the sense of the space between the old vision of the urban future and the new vision taking shape. This is the space that one of your main characters in The City Under the Skin occupies in his role, in his hobby as an urban explorer. He's an explorer of urban ruins, or something to that effect. I forget what exact term he uses, but when did you become aware this was a not widely, but this was a sort of pursued hobby by thousands of people?
Well, I've always known that I did it, although I didn't put a name to it until comparatively recently. I mean, given that I do so much walking, I didn't want to make my character just another walker. That seemed like that was just sort of too Nicholsonian, if you want a better word. So I wanted him to be an explorer, but not simply a pedestrian. And it was, I mean, I think that a lot of us pre-internet, certainly many of us pursued our interests such as they were, and apart from the sort of the obvious ones like, stamp collecting or antique cars.
Model planes.
Well, there wasn't really you didn't have any great sense of a community. Right. And certainly as far as exploring odd bits of the city, it's definitely a thing you want to do with one or, on your own or with one or two other people. You don't want to be in a group of 20. Right. And that being in a group changes the experience kind of dramatically, that it's about being on your own and making the discoveries for yourself. And that's kind of the character we have there. And I suppose he's, to that limited extent, he resembles me. And of course, he then finds the woman who is exploring the city for reasons of her own, and that they have a kind of, the Venn diagrams overlap, and we eventually discover why they overlap, though they're by no means identical. And I guess that's what many of us do, isn't it? We have friends who share some of our interests, and we can meet them on a certain amount of common ground, but in the end, we want to explore in a different way, or we have different feelings about cities and places and exploration than our companions do.
One of the most interesting sections of Walking in Ruins for an Angelino is, of course, going to be your chapter about walking through ruins in Hollywood. It very much put me in the mind of this character of The City Under the Skin. It's no longer really thought of as a ruined place, though, Hollywood, is it? I mean, you can find ruins, but you do have to look these days. You can't necessarily stumble into a ruin unless you're in Griffith Park and you come across that zoo, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, that's part of the success and the prosperity of what's happening in Hollywood. And, from what I'm, from my, I don't wish to make grand pronouncements, but clearly Hollywood is a very prosperous place right now. I mean, much of it is speculative, and whether 5 years down the road it's all going to look like some idiotic bubble. Why did they build that, that ridiculous apartment block on that grim corner on Sunset and Gower or wherever they're building?
You had a specific corner in mind.
I do, but that's not that's not the one. And I see the same in Manhattan. There is no part of Manhattan so grim that someone isn't trying to sell a luxury apartment there.
And indeed London now. And
London just seems to be exploding with wealth and development and I guess optimism as well. And the buildings look kind of shiny and playful to an extent, with a lot of balconies, a lot of glass, a lot of colored facings. These are buildings where people can have fun, that your life will not be grim. And Sheffield, my hometown, that has, they just sold their first £1 million apartment in Sheffield. My mother, who died not that long ago, that would have, you could have hit her over the head with a brick before she'd believe that you could sell a £1 million apartment in Sheffield. And that there is a certain, I guess it may be an architectural similarity, or a kind of cultural, aspirational similarity that people in Sheffield and Manhattan and San Diego, where I was at the weekend, have an aspiration, or at least developers believe they had an aspiration to live in a kind of modern 2000s, sit on the balcony, listen to your iPod, and be part of a generated world.
Do cities develop in any way other than through bubbles? It seems like, at least for certainly in my lifetime and most of the past century that I can think of, bubbles only ever, it's cities sort of seem to get abandoned, bubble back up, get abandoned, bubble back up. It seems like there's no other way for a city to build up any more than a bubble.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but development, or planning, let's call it planning. When they were trying to revitalize the docks in London in the 1980s, it pretty much turned into a free-for-all. And the planning regulations were relaxed to a ridiculous degree. And it did seem to work. These completely neglected and despised areas down by the Docklands, if they had been, if local government or central government had put together a plan for how to revitalize the London Docklands, it would have been a grim failure. Well, this is an argument, and the fact that you let the market forces. I mean, we believed a lot. I think we believe a lot more in the market now than today. Although I'm
goes
sure,
back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who are immensely pro-market. But of course, I mean, I haven't absolutely kept my eye on this, but there's now, is it a $2 billion or $100 billion plan to revitalize the LA River?
It sounds like something that is where the gears are turning, if slowly.
It does seem that when developers think they can make a ton of money out of developing ruined areas, then things start to happen. And I think you're probably right that the idea of slow, steady progress is no
longer the done thing.
Well, I'm thinking about the World Cup in Brazil, which we're told is, a disaster, that, nothing's finished, nothing's built. Millions, if not billions of dollars have gone into that, and nobody seems to know exactly where they've gone. And there is some notion that at the end they'll be left with a bunch of ruined shells. But of course, this was, again, talked about in London, that they built the Millennium Dome, which everyone said was going to be the most terrible white elephant. And now, it's an extraordinarily successful music venue. And the people who own it are making a ton of money. The Olympic Stadium there in London, which people said would be loathed and despised, and I think we've both discovered people seem to be rather fond of it.
Yes, I focus on this because it's so at the core of The City Under the Skin, this idea of the struggle for the future form, the future image of a city. There's always going to be somebody arguing for everything, it seems like, and that's an idea incorporated into the novel, is that someone's always going to be at odds with somebody else where the form of a city is concerned. Is that an idea you subscribe to?
Yeah, very much so. I think that's put rather more articulately than it may be in the book. But yeah, maybe it's just life, but certainly cities, that there are a bunch of competing interests, and the interests will never be identical or even symbiotic. So there will always be winners and losers. I think probably we should also say that one of the things that is both a plot feature of the book, but also a kind of metaphor for the book is mapping.
Yes, indeed.
And that maps are always made in somebody's interests. The idea of an entirely neutral map is just not possible. And you see that when if you go on Google Maps, there'll be certain cafes and buildings that are marked, and certain ones that aren't.
Probably not accidental.
Not accidental. None of it's ever accidental. And the idea that you can just map a place or look at a place and see it in a neutral way. I mean, in a sort of at a low level, if you're interested in mid-century architecture, you see the mid-century architecture. Right. If you're interested in freeway design, you'll see where the freeways go and how that works. If you're interested in green spaces, open spaces, you'll look at the map and observe that there is or isn't green space.
This is the same map. You're just seeing different things on it.
Exactly.
This reminds me of, actually, I've been fantasizing about doing this for the past few months. I don't know how I would even accomplish it, but just to carry around a stack of sheets of paper and to everybody I meet, hand them one and say, draw me a map of Los Angeles. Because no two are going to look remotely the same if you do that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't. If you'd asked me to, you should have asked me to do that before. No, exactly. What
do you draw first? If I was to say, draw a map of Los Angeles, what goes down first, and what do you think? What lines do you draw outward from there?
Well, this seems. I do believe, for a start, that everybody has their own mental map of everywhere, and that's fine. We each of us carries around a map of LA or any city where we live, and they never quite combine, and obviously you tend to, where you happen to be tends to be at the center. So for me, Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood Boulevard, Franklin, those are my three streets. The thing that looms largest in my life is the 405. The cliche of all cliches that, once I start getting within a couple of miles of the 405, I start getting the heebie-jeebies. So on my map,
it's our very own Berlin Wall in a way.
Well, yeah, on my map of LA, it's this big sort of gouge in the earth. So, here'd be dragons. And,
Mara Incognita.
Yeah, exactly so. Hollywood's what I know best, but I kind of know Silver Lake and downtown. But I'm not, I'm pretty vague about the gaps between these places. It would be a very poor map.
They would all be poor maps. I'd just be handing them a sheet of paper.
Yeah. It's a fascinating idea. And
it's one that would appeal to the main character of your book, no doubt. He's working in a map shop, none too lucratively, considers himself a map nerd. He's very much into this idea of the images of a city we have in our head. And it's a type of, is map nerdism in the ascendant, even if maps themselves are changing in form and in usage?
Well, I mean, this may be part of the same business of the the history of the future. I mean, that there are certain technologies that seem to disappear and then come back. I mean, vinyl seems to be the number one. It was the most. Well, it was the only format. Then it became the despised format. Now it's the loved format. And there are certain formats you think are gone forever. You can't really imagine that the 8-track cartridge is going to make a comeback. But some guy out there.
People like to rewind. They're never going to play those.
No, I mean, some guy out there probably thinks it's the best thing in the world, and Lord knows he can probably put a collection together without spending much money.
He's got the quadraphonic sound system.
Oh yes, and the map. I mean, I am not my characters, but I generally share enough DNA or markers with them. I've always liked maps. When I used to go on vacation with my parents, the place would only seem kind of real if I could buy a map and say, "Oh, there's something down the road there. Let's go and see that." And it didn't seem particularly eccentric, but I'm aware that this is not strictly what every 11-year-old boy does. And I certainly don't collect maps, but I've got a big box downstairs of maps that I've picked up on vacation, on my travels, some of which are actually kind of useful, some of which are decorative, that work as tourist objects. And some of them are good for getting you from A to B, and some of them, are only good for getting you from the Ferris wheel to the roller coaster.
They'll take you where they want to show you.
Exactly so, as maps are wont to do. I'm still, because I lead such a sedentary life, and I can easily turn into a hermit. I never really embraced the smartphone because, I just, if I've got something serious to look up, I'll look it up in my real computer. Right. So when I'm out and about, I have the most basic of all possible cell phones, and I use it to make phone calls and occasionally a text. With the proviso, therefore, that if I'm going somewhere I don't know, I'll sit down at my computer, make a map, print it off, right, and put that in the car with me, which is probably the worst of all possible worlds. I mean, and very, very old school, or ancient old school. But the idea that, the character Zach in the book, he's very much aware that he's dealing with a dated commodity, and there is that sense.
It's part of the appeal.
It's part of the appeal for him, and that's why there's a market for. That's why he sells to people who are interested, and he is aware that there are times when it may just be easier to look on your smartphone and find the little pulse, and that's where you are.
Right. But if you need a map where a serial killer put down X's where he did all his murders, Zach's your man.
Absolutely. Hand-drawn maps, as we've been saying, are obviously the most personal, but you can even personalize, a map of a city. Again, when I used to live in London, I lived everywhere. I seemed to move every 2 or 3 months, and I once sat down with a big map and put a little cross at all the places where I had lived. And it was the most sort of eccentric. I tried to look at it and think, is there some sort of logic, or could someone look at this and say, oh yes, he's moving in this direction or that direction?
Just insanity if they look at it.
Well, yeah, it's completely random. It seems completely random, and it is to an extent. But yes, if you showed it to someone and said, this is where these X's mark places where terrible, terrible things happen, and given some of my apartments, terrible things did happen. But yes, if I could draw that map by hand, and it would be, profoundly mine. But even if I draw it on a pre-existing map, it's still I still make it mine, and it has symbols and markings that I understand that other people don't, and that's essentially what all maps are about.
I mentioned this murder map, which is an element of the city under the skin, and I'll emphasize to the listener, this isn't just a novel of city planning and geography nerdism and urban exploration. It's also a novel of kidnapping and murder and all manner of intrigue. When did it become that in the conception or writing process? When did you decide this would be, or did the sort of thrills and the murders come first and the mapping come second? What was the order?
It's hard to say. I mean, one of the things that I did realize that I guess probably my greatest hit as a novelist was a book called was Bleeding London, which we've mentioned. And that's sort of a book in which I guess the city is a character, and that's the metaphor in the title, that London is a being that breathes, and it has a heart and a gut, and it makes you bleed. So it had all this kind of, for want of a better word, literary element to it. And it did, but it also has a kind of a strong through, a revenge plot. Some man is trying to punish people who do something terrible to his girlfriend. One of the things that, I eventually learned about that, multiple people have tried to make movies of that book. And
what stage does it freeze at?
It freezes at the stage where if you just run through the plot, it doesn't. You've got a plot, but so what? And the thing that people actually like about the book is the stuff about the city as the living, breathing organism, and how we relate to strange places, and how strange places embrace us, and we embrace them, or they punish us, and that the plot on its own doesn't take you to the places you want to go. But it does occur to me, or it did, that once you've got a sort of a through plot, or, a thriller plot, for want of a better word, you can hang all kinds of eccentricities or weird stuff or obsessions on it.
That robust frame is there, and then go wild.
Yeah. And that's kind of what's going on in The City Under the Skin. There's it's not so much who done it, but why they did it and what does it mean. Shall we explain the plot?
I feel that if a book is actually spoiled by spoilers, it's not much of a book. And I think The City Under the Skin is not spoiled by spoilers, thriller though it may be.
Yeah. So, basically, women start appearing. Women who've been pulled off the street, kidnapped, and maps. It takes us a while to be certain that they are maps, but maps of something have been tattooed very roughly, very crudely, deliberately crudely, it appears, on their backs, and then they're released. So there are a number, we're not sure how many at first, number of women who are wandering around with these maps tattooed on their backs. And there's a good deal of who did it, what does it mean, what's it a map of. The maps seem to mean nothing to anybody. So our hero, Zach, who is the map expert, is the go-to guy, and he looks at them, and he's trying to impress his girlfriend. So he has all he says the kind of things we've been saying, that maps are always made in somebody's interest, and the interest may not be yours. And in this case, it's certainly not in the interest of the poor women who had this done to them. And I guess one of the things that historically I've always written about, or one of my obsessions, is the relationship between people and things. A lot of my characters do tend to be obsessed with objects, whether guitars or
Volkswagen,
women's shoes, and the map is a particularly interesting one in that it clearly is an object, and it can be appreciated as an object, but it always has some relationship to the world out there. It has a meaning in the bigger world. And of course, as far as imposing these tattooed maps on the women, it's kind of a way of turning a person into a thing, that the woman loses her identity as a human being and becomes a map, becomes part of a scheme, becomes part of someone else's obsession. And I mean, I found that a very rich and kind of interesting notion that, we think we're these energies and spiritual dimensions, but we are also things. We're flesh and blood, and we have this physical existence which, we don't and probably shouldn't want to overcome, but that, and that we are more than just objects, we are more than just maps, and that there's a punishment, there's a kind of desecration of the body that this tattooing represents.
Do you think of a book like Walking in Ruins, a nonfiction book, a book of essays, as also having a kind of story to it, despite that it doesn't need that sort of thriller plot that The City Under the Skin does? Does Walking in Ruins have or need a story?
It needs a structure, I guess. I find myself often reading non-fiction books where there's a slightly bogus quest element that has been added. And
one man's year of eating only vegetables, we've all seen them.
Yeah. And sometimes that, people are searching for a discovery which, if they'd had a lick of sense, they'd have discovered on day 3 of the writing process.
A pamphlet, then you get not a book.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you need a shape, a structure. And a writer's under no obligation to put all his cards on the table on day 1, on the first chapter. But he's got to be honest with the reader. I don't think you can sort of say, you can't pretend that you're working towards some great revelation when the great revelation is there from the beginning.
It's inside you all along, I guess.
Heaven is always inside you, yeah.
Some of these quests in Walking in Ruins, they take you to ruins very far away indeed from the big city or this city or another. One of them is a ruin that's fascinated me for a long time. I've never been there, though. But thinking of the 1960s, being put in the mind, the sort of Telstar hotels of the world put me in the mind of, real or imagined. In the 60s, Los Angeles was expanding so rapidly, and there was such a push for sort of vacation communities far flung outside the city. And I was reading recently Christopher Rand's book, Los Angeles, the Ultimate City, from 1967. He talks about Salton City, near the Salton Sea, being pitched as this is the next big vacation destination. This is it. This is going to be huge. You visit Salton City, the Salton Sea, in Walking in Ruins. It didn't pan out, did it?
No. And, as we sit here today with the benefit of hindsight, it seems a ludicrous notion that it ever would. But whether it's any more ludicrous than Palm Springs, I'm not sure. I mean, I remember the first time I went there. I mean, not quite by chance, but I was driving, on a road trip, and looked on the map, and it's called a city, so you kind of think, there's something there.
You expect a certain thing when you read city.
Well, the thing we were looking for was breakfast,
Yes.
And from a distance, the structures are still there, and there are things that looks like, 2 miles away in the distance, that looks like a cafe, that looks like a motel, and you think, well, that's a place, and when you get there, it's a non-place, I guess. I'm sure Marc Auger would have a rather specific notion of what a non-place is. I mean, I love the place. I love the Salton Sea. I love all those surrounding communities like Bombay Beach. And
what can one do at the Salton Sea? I mean, there's certainly walking around it to be done.
Well, I mean, and poking around in ruins is the other thing. People do fish, but I mean, I like the desert in pretty much all its forms, but the Mojave Desert particularly. The sort of the oddness, the singularity of this piece of water there, which isn't really natural in any meaningful sense. I mean, it was created by a flood, and it remains there because of overflow from agriculture. But as irrigation methods become more sophisticated and as water becomes more valuable, there will be less and less runoff. So
even the ruin will be another more ruined ruin at some time in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a ruined environment because it was a hollow that was flooded. So that's one kind of ruin. The sea. The sea gets ruined every year because there's liquid and salt, and at a certain point, things can live there. And as the sun beats down and the water becomes more and more concentrated, more saturated with salt, it becomes uninhabitable. And then next year there's runoff from the mountains again. So it is. Yeah, I mean, it's ruin and non-ruin in fairly constant rotation, but not permanent. There are there are clearly people who still live there. I mean, there's a bar. I think Anthony Bourdain has done a program from the bar in Bombay Beach. People clearly do live there, and it's a very edgy kind of existence. And I think you'll know from my book, Walking in Ruins, I do like edgelands.
But how far did you have to go for breakfast from that particular edgeland?
Yeah, a long way. I think we were probably in Arizona before we I mean, if there was a gas station, one wouldn't starve. But, and yes, I mean, quite often, edgelands don't have to be on the edge. You know, you just go down, 2 blocks from the main drag and you're on some kind of edge. And I'm fascinated by those kind of, what are they, alleys or access streets that you find around LA, and even in Beverly Hills. So if you go half a block and poke around the back of the street that gives you access to the Jimmy Choo store, I mean, there's the bits of ruined. Do I mean ruined? But sort of patterned. Masonry and things falling apart, that because it's a facade, the thing that faces the street is what people see, and it's only map nerds like me or urban explorers who go around, and I don't want to give the impression that I'm some sort of that my interest is perverse. It's not like I don't want to go to the Taj Mahal and go through the garbage cans. But that idea of, here's the facade and what's behind the facade is all part of the urban exploration project, I think.
Is it true? I mean, does Los Angeles have more of these sort of neglected spaces that themselves fall through the cracks than other cities you've been to? Or is that just an impression we get living here?
Again, not my area of expertise, but I'm guessing that, as it were, this is a controversial word, the sprawl of LA does mean that there can often be quite large gaps between things. I think they're filling in fairly rapidly.
I was going to ask, with the amount of, they call it infill, but you can see it happening. You can only go so far out. Los Angeles went that far out 30 years ago. Do you fear the loss of the in-between spaces?
Well, I do. I mean, I found there's a wonderful. It's on Western, and it's just below Sunset, I think. And there's a gas station, or a former gas station, and it's right behind where they're now building the brand new Target. And Target's going to be this. Not very tall. I think it's like 5 stories. It's not high rise. But it's going to be this shiny, big building that will blot out the sun in certain angles. And behind it, there is this old gas station. And I can't tell what's going on there. Sometimes I look in and it seems like there may be somebody living there. But if you own that piece of real estate in that bit of LA, it's valuable in some way.
Yes.
It's valuable to somebody. And somebody thinks either they may be holding on to it because they think it'll be worth more. If they,
some eccentric owner they can't find. These are all plausible in Los Angeles, these stories.
They're totally plausible. Not very far from here, which seems a pleasant enough area. There used to be it was called the Haunted House.
Oh, it used to be. Now, this is a house you write about in Walking in Ruins. Is it gone?
It's gone.
Oh, when did that disappear? How long after the book did the house go away?
Pretty much on the time that the book was published.
Oh, one day it was there, one day it wasn't, this haunted house?
It's there, and it's been restored.
Oh, it's not haunted anymore.
No, so my whole fantasy there in the book is that it's this... it was this rather rustic house on the top of a hill, and I always imagined that it would slide down the hill and become a complete ruin. And I was enjoying watching that process. It had wooden balconies that were coming away from the wall. Mm-hmm. And, I don't walk by it that often, but, maybe once a month, maybe every 6 weeks. And one day I'm there, and it's all been spruced up, and it's got new windows, and I think the balconies are gone, so there's nothing falling down. It's been painted.
Gone today, here tomorrow.
Exactly. Exactly. So my whole conceit about this little bit of Hollywood falling into complete rack and ruin or being replaced. That's definitely a make, do, and mend.
I think I've had to come into the Hollywood Hills twice in the time I've lived in Los Angeles, both to interview you. So it's not an area that I have a great grasp on, but it's fascinating because you mentioned your love of the desert, which is one of the lovely places in California, certainly. And people would say the same about the Hollywood Hills, I think. But in both cases, they do raise the question, how did things get to be here? Like, it's whether out in the desert, how did the settlement get to be out there? And indeed, up in the hills, you have to go straight up a road for what feels like 10 minutes to get here. It's like, this is interesting. Like, how did things get here? How did it occur to people to put things here? Is that a question that's ever been in your mind?
Somewhat. I know a little bit about, I've read a book about the history of Hollywood land, which is, which is why we have the sign. And, of course, we've all seen those pictures that it looks like, if not quite desert, certainly, scrubby hills. And then someone decides to build a road, and then someone sees that there's a real estate opportunity. There's always been this notion, I think, in LA that elevation is kind of advantage. That living on, if you could live on the very top above.
It's like how goats instinctively climb upward.
Yeah, if you're there, if you've got the big house on top of the hill that overlooks the Sunset Strip, you've really made it.
Right. You're not near the hookers at that point.
We're still near enough.
Just near enough.
To be fair, where we're sitting now, you actually go up the hill and then you come down again. So we've kind of lost the advantage. But we're looking, as we look out there, there's a sort of modern post and beam house where rock and roll bands are put up when they're visiting town.
It's owned by a venue?
One never knows.
True.
In this neighborhood, no one. I know my neighbors' names, but what they do and how they make their money is.
Yes, I'd rather not have that known.
I think that we'd all rather not have that known. And of course, we're all kind of cheek by jowl here. Actually, the houses are quite close, but because of the hill. I don't know if
I would call this cheek by jowl. By what standard?
Well, okay, but if you look out here, if we were on the flat, these people here would be extraordinarily close.
Well, you don't share a wall with them running.
We don't share a wall. No, these are fatuous notions.
But I get what you mean. This is what I want to know about. It's when I ask by what standard are you cheek by jowl, it's a real question. There is a standard here in place, an idea of living that developed here, and I just wonder what you know about it.
Not much. When I came to LA, I always imagined I'd end up in Atwater Village. Yeah. Atwater Village seemed sort of my kind of place. It's got that little the Englishman in his castle sort of idea. Everyone's got their little house, their little box, and their little patch of land.
The English dream is not so different from the American dream in a way.
Very much so.
The American dream came from it, I guess. So.
And I think it's much rarer in England, in fact. It was, the semi-detached house is enormously popular in England. I mean, almost ubiquitous. I mean, my parents lived in a semi, and that was, they'd moved up in the world to get to the semi, but they could never quite make that leap into the detached house. That was, but, in LA, there are detached houses in the ghetto. It's not
especially there, in fact.
Yeah. And, good fences make good neighbors and all that stuff. One thing I do know, which you may not want to put on to broadcast.
You'll be the judge.
Well, on the lease here, which doesn't go back very far, not the lease, but the deeds, only goes back to the 30s. I don't know who owned it before then. It says, no Hindus. Hindus are not allowed to live here.
Specifically
Hindus.
Am I cutting this in or leaving it? Cutting this out or leaving it in? It seems like no one's going to. I don't know if any Hindus will be mad at this, but when did you discover this?
Well, just when we bought the house, we saw the deeds, and in some ways it seems like it's. As you say, why the Hindus?
It's the strangest group to exclude.
I mean, is it that they simply... You can imagine that they never thought, African Americans would ever be able to live here, or Mexicans.
If any group has a chance, that's the one. We'll keep them out.
Why the Hindus were singled out from all the other ethnic groups which might aspire to live here. Perhaps they just thought that there were some rich Hindus who were planning on moving in.
So it's a specific people. They might have said, well, we don't want those. We don't want them in there specifically. We know their designs. I imagine, though, you look at the deeds of a lot of houses around you, you see some weird stuff. You just, is that the type of document that's on a deed? The deed says no Hindus, or where do you think you find the strangest stuff in the documentation of homes in Los Angeles, be it no Hindus or anything else?
Well, Hancock Park, I believe, used to be a no Jews allowed, and that seems to carry on because I talk to Jewish people who say rather be seen dead than go into Hancock Park. Presumably this is now completely illegal. It's not. The law has changed, and you can't discriminate on those terms. But I do find it interesting that. Yeah, it was the poor old Hindus who were. Although maybe or maybe it's a compliment, that they.
With the new developments we're all seeing in Los Angeles now, you're walking around, you're looking at them go up, whether they're appealing or not. Are you thinking about what they'll look like in their inevitable days as ruins?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean that. We come to Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler before very long, don't we? That between them. Speer and Hitler came up with the notion that buildings should be built with their eventual ruin in mind, taking the classical example that even when the Third Reich had disappeared, however many thousands of years that was in the future, the buildings or the ruins of the buildings would remain, and people would say, what a fine, great civilization it must have been if these are the ruins left behind. And that certainly does apply to the ancient world, the classical world. It's kind of hard to imagine, that people are going to look at the Kodak Theatre. As we now conceive of LA, very little is being allowed to fall into ruin. That if the Kodak Theatre was regarded as untenable, it would be demolished and replaced. You do need something, out there on the edge. There's a lot of stuff online about malls, ruined malls.
Some are now in a ruined state, essentially.
I could certainly there used to be one in Barstow that I used to wander around and look at. And they have a sort of ghostly quality because they're so nondescript to start with. It is a large box. And the signs remain, the big tall signs that would have the name of the mall and the names of the companies inside, and the names are the first thing to fall off. Right. They either get covered up or they fall off, or somebody steals them. And they have this sort of sense of, what would a future generation make of this? Is it a temple? Is it a housing development?
The aspirations of the mall are almost still visible, but they're very modest aspirations. So it's unusual to see something modest in ruins. Do you know what I mean?
Well, of course, in the desert, I love looking at these strange little cabins that, which can never have been very substantial to start with. And, when I poke around in them, I do see, you see the remains of a life that, and in many cases, it seems like people have just said, I've had enough of this, and walked out the door.
Yes, left it where it stood.
Yeah, that's where it stood, and, there's always a pair of shoes left behind, and there'll be some children's toys, and, a motor manual. And I think that's one of the things we always do when we look at ruins, isn't it? We try to imagine what the life was that was there, and how people lived, and what they did, and what the structures meant to them.
This is really the novelist's mind, is it not, at work?
I think it is, but I don't think it's only a novelist. I think that, that's why people are fascinated by Pompeii and the ruins of Pompeii, because you've got that snapshot of exactly how, that people were there at that very moment.
Graffiti and all.
Indeed.
I don't know, I think the Bonaventure is going to make a cool ruin. What do you think?
Oh, it is. The question is, what's going to happen to the glass?
Yes.
Is the glass going to stay there, or is the glass going to fall off?
And which is more interesting?
Well, it would be, at the moment, the glass is so much a part of the structure. Those columns, or whatever you want to call them. Once the glass was gone, it would become this curious kind of cylindrical skeleton, or four cylindrical skeletons.
Do you envision squatters taking up in the revolving restaurant?
Well, I'd be one of the first ones there. Fortunately, our heroine there in City Under the Skin, she's got a certain status around the place, so she lives alone in the revolving restaurant. You certainly wouldn't want to have a communal squat in a revolving restaurant. That would seem to be asking for too much, asking for trouble. But that always seems to be the nature of squatting anyway. There's always a good deal too much communality and discussion of communality.
You can find out more about what status this character has at the Telstar Hotel by reading The City Under the Skin, the new novel by Geoff Nicholson, who's been my guest today. Jeff, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, John Wolfe, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.